Imagine a place where rules don't exist, where you can build your home with whatever you have on hand, without worrying about taxes or the oppression of the system. A place where the desert winds carry not just dust, but also promises of freedom. Now, close your eyes and try to visualize this place. Sounds like a dream, doesn't it? But what if I told you that this place exists, and it's called Slab City, a forgotten piece of the world, right in the heart of the California desert, that, for many, it's the last true land of freedom in America. A paradise for some, a prison for others. You might be thinking, this place must be amazing, right? After all, who wouldn't want to live without rules, without the pressure of everyday life, without bills, and without that constant weight of society? Well, the truth is that the concept of freedom in Slab City is anything but simple. If you thought that the idea of living in a place without government or laws would be an idyllic and carefree life, you're mistaken. The reality behind this isolated community is much more complex and at times dark. Slab City is located in the Sonoran Desert in Imperial County, California, about 80 kilometers from the border with Mexico. Near the Salton Sea, this place was once a military camp during World War II. Today, Slab City is famous for being a community of survivors, artists, retirees, digital nomads, and yes, also people who can't or don't want to live under the rules of conventional society. But here's the real hook. At the same time that this is a land of freedom, it is also a breeding ground for dirt, neglect, and crime. Slab City, for many, is a place of resistance and creativity. But for others, it's a refuge for those escaping a dark past of a life filled with despair. And if you think you're ready for the freedom of this place, it would be wise to think twice. Imagine a winter where the temperatures are mild, with people like snowbirds, retirees who escape the harsh cold from other states, bringing more life to the place. Summer, however, tells a different story. Only about 150 brave souls remain. If you thought you could find a perfect refuge, the summer in Slab City will test your physical and mental endurance. There is no basic infrastructure. No running water, no electricity, no sewage, no supermarket, not even a bank. To get the basics, like water, the residents buy it from trucks, or improvise their own systems, like storage tanks. Need some light? Better to have solar panels or a generator. And that's just the beginning of the long list of challenges. Here, exchanges happen without intermediaries. Need anything? Trade with your neighbor or improvise with what you have. Life isn't easy, but it's also not a constant war, as some might imagine. There is something that can be called a sense of community in Slab City. A collective spirit that allows people to still support each other, despite all the difficulties. The community library, the cafe with Wi-Fi, and the famous The Range, an outdoor space for shows and events, are the gathering places. These little cultural oases in the middle of the desert are what keep the flame of Slab City alive. The mix of freedom and difficulties is what makes Slab City so unique. But it's also what makes life there, for many, a constant survival game. The biggest question hanging in the air is, how far would you go to live without the ties? From society, would you be willing to give up comfort, security, even running water, just to live in a place where the only rule is to survive on your own? And this is where the real question arises. Is it worth paying the price for total freedom? Would the lack of governance and the absence of structure be a fair price to have the possibility of living without rules, without pressures, but also without security? And with all the challenges that Slab City offers, every day the people who choose to live there face this reflection. And the most interesting thing is that everyone has a different answer. The feeling of freedom in Slab City is undeniable, but at the same time, it mixes with a huge dose of reality. Here, life isn't about surviving comfortably, but rather about surviving with the bare minimum and the maximum of resilience. Living in Slab City requires creativity, persistence, and perhaps most importantly, the ability to accept the lack of control. And this lack of control, that's what makes it so fascinating. But what happens when the dream of living in absolute freedom starts to crumble? When the harshness of the desert and the daily challenges become unbearable? In Slab City, the landscape is constantly shaped by the battle between the promise of a free life and the immense costs of that freedom. Even with all the creativity and autonomy that the residents have to live their way, the consequences of that choice are right in front of their eyes. The history of Slab City, for many, begins with the arrival of the first residents after the deactivation of the military base Camp Dunlap in the 1950s. When the United States government deactivated the military base and removed all the structures, leaving only the concrete foundations, the so-called slabs, a small community of people began to form. Those who arrived there were largely nomads and war veterans. People who, in some way, needed a place to escape. Or maybe, in simpler terms, a place where they could be free. But the idea of freedom, as you might imagine, is different for everyone. Slab City is, in many ways, a land of nomads, but it is also a territory that makes no concessions. Life there is not for the weak. The heat, the lack of resources, the inability to access essential services, all of this makes any everyday activity a challenge. However, this same difficulty is what unites the community. There is no authority or police to intervene in conflicts, and that can be both liberating and dangerous. Imagine that you are in a place where justice is decided by each individual and where self-defense and vigilance are each person's responsibility. For those who enjoy living on the fringes of society, this might sound like paradise, and for those who are not prepared for this reality, the darker side of Slab City reveals itself in the stories that circulate among the residents. As in any place where absolute freedom prevails, there are extremes. Some residents try to create a life of peace and tranquility, but others, often running from something in their past, can turn the community into something more chaotic. This is where danger and opportunity coexist, often in a disconcerting way. In an environment where there are no clear rules, morality becomes relative. The tensions among the residents can turn into petty thefts, violent fights, or even the use of illegal substances. And as we've seen, in a place without governance, without policing, there is nothing, or no one, to mediate or control these conflicts. A clear example of this was the murder of Paul Dewin Black, a 21-year-old transgender person, in 2021. This case brought to light the vulnerability of those who choose to live in Slab City, a place where safety is not guaranteed by any external force. For many, this episode was a bitter reminder that, no matter how precious freedom is, it comes with a series of risks and consequences that not everyone is ready to handle. But even with the violence and instability, Slab City still holds a certain magic. There's something fascinating about the fact that, despite all the adversity, the residents don't give up on the place. Many, instead of surrendering to chaos, end up finding creative ways to overcome difficulties. This spirit of resistance and resilience is what keeps the place alive, despite all the contradictions that surround it. For example, the library. The community center is one of the hubs of Slab City, serving as a cultural refuge. Even in a place where everything seems on the brink of collapse, people still gather to exchange books, ideas, and stories. This shows that, even in the most inhospitable conditions, the human need for connection and learning remains intact. Another essential meeting point is the range, an outdoor space where artists and musicians perform. Despite the difficulties of the place, music and art continue to be the soul of Slab City. After all, if life is tough, it should at least be lived with creativity and expression, right? Still, the sense of community doesn't mean that everyone shares the same ideal of freedom. Living together with people from different backgrounds and motivations can sometimes create tensions that lead to conflicts. The lack of infrastructure and the constant pressure for scarce resources make the relationships among the residents complicated. Each person there has their own way of dealing with survival. Some create support networks, taking care of one another. Others isolate themselves and seek to live in absolute solitude. Isolation, in fact, can be a strategy, since living with others also means sharing the little you have. The lack of essential resources is also a reflection of the environmental impact of a life without rules. The waste management system is practically non-existent, and many residents are forced to deal with the impacts of not having a proper place to dispose of their trash. The environmental pressure on the local ecosystem is a growing challenge. With the intense heat and lack of water, the makeshift solutions for resource storage make life even harder. Everything you consider simple, like taking a shower for example, becomes a real task. You have to make do whatever it takes to ensure a minimum level of comfort, but that doesn't guarantee anything. And here's another one. A facet of Slab City that makes its freedom so unique. The need for improvisation. Nothing is certain, nothing is guaranteed, and everything needs to be built or found in some way. This can be both a blessing and a curse. For those with a creative spirit, the possibilities are endless. For others, the struggle for resources becomes a constant battle. As the sun sets over the Slab City horizon, the desert calms down, but the fight for survival continues. What began as a dream of freedom turns, for many, into a constant battle against the scorching heat, the scarcity of resources, and the lack of a clear future. Slab City, with all its mystique and attractiveness, begins to show a dark side that many prefer to ignore. The land where the community is settled belongs to the United States government, and there are discussions about the possible use or sale of the land. This puts at risk the entire lifestyle that the residents have built over the years, making the future of Slab City uncertain. The land of Slab City was neither bought nor legally occupied. It's public land, and its ownership has always been precarious. This means that the future of the community depends on the government's will, which can, at any moment, sell or use the area for other purposes. Discussions about what to do with the land are constant, and many residents fear that, at some point, an urbanization project will be implemented, or a real estate development interest could lead to their makeshift homes and alternative lifestyles being destroyed in the name of progress. This fear of Slab City's disappearance is one of the reasons why its inhabitants continue to fight to keep the community alive and unique. Many of the older residents resist external pressures and fight to ensure that the culture and spirit of freedom in Slab City endure. However, this constant struggle for survival, along with uncertainty about the future, makes many feel increasingly disconnected from a world that does not share them. Values of freedom and autonomy. Moreover, the environmental pressure on Slab City is increasing. The Sonoran Desert is one of the most arid and hottest environments on the planet, and climate change has made the temperatures even more extreme. During the summer, temperatures exceed 45 degrees Celsius, making it almost impossible for any human to live comfortably there. Although many residents adapt, the harsh reality is that extreme weather conditions are increasingly a challenge. The suffocating heat, the scarcity of water, and the lack of any kind of basic infrastructure transform life in the desert. In a test of endurance, but also in a constant struggle against adversity. The lack of basic sanitation and the difficulty of accessing clean water are two of the biggest challenges faced by the residents of Slab City. There is no plumbing or sewage system, and water is transported by trucks that come periodically to supply the community. However, this water is limited, and on many occasions, residents find themselves forced to store it in makeshift tanks. This not only makes life more difficult, but also puts the health of those living there at risk. And even with all these challenges, there is still an optimistic outlook for Slab City. There are those who believe that if the community stays united and works together, it will be possible to maintain this alternative and free lifestyle. However, this requires more than just resilience. It requires a change in mindset, a transformation in the way people perceive and deal with natural resources and the environment. In a place where survival is a constant challenge, the idea of living without modern conveniences requires much more than just courage. It requires a true re-engineering of everyday life. Art and culture continue to be the foundation of Slab City. The famous Salvation Mountain, a hill covered in vibrant paintings and messages of love and faith, has become a global icon. Created by the artist Leonard Knight, this masterpiece of colors and shapes is a testament to the belief that, even amidst the aridity of the desert, it is possible to find beauty and meaning. Salvation Mountain is not just a tourist attraction, but a representation of the community spirit and the resistance against the hardships of life in the desert. Another artistic expression that stands out in Slab City is the East Jesus Gallery, where recycled materials are transformed into unique art. Old cars, pieces of metal, and even broken appliances gain new life in the hands of local artists. This open-air gallery is not just a space for creation, but also a symbol of how art can flourish, even in adverse conditions. The lack of resources, instead of being an obstacle, becomes an opportunity for creative expression. And this is something that is reflected throughout the place. Every house, every fence, and every piece of improvised furniture. It's a work of art in itself, a reflection of the personality and creativity of the residents. But behind this appearance of freedom and creativity, there is a constant pressure for survival. Although many find ways to live without the rules of society, it comes at the cost of constant insecurity. The lack of policing and the absence of a formal legal system mean that disputes among residents are resolved, often in a violent way, or at the very least with great tension. This creates an unpredictable environment where the feeling of freedom is always on the brink of collapse. Safety is one of the biggest concerns for those living in Slab City. Each resident must ensure their own protection and that of their property, as there is no authority to intervene in cases of theft or violence. In some situations, this leads to a sense of widespread distrust, where no one really knows who is a friend or an enemy. The lack of governance also means that health and public safety issues are left to makeshift solutions. Despite all this, the residents of Slab City are, for the most part, resilient people. They have learned to adapt to a lifestyle that isn't easy, but offers the freedom to live outside the system. Each person deals with the difficulties in their own way, but they all share a common belief that freedom is worth it, even if it brings immense risks and challenges. And now, with the future of the city being threatened by external and internal forces, Slab City continues to exist on the edge in a precarious balance between resistance and destruction. The feeling of freedom is intense, but like all freedom, it comes with a weight. Those who live there know this, and even though the end of Slab City seems inevitable, for its residents, what matters is living by their own rules, no matter how difficult they are to follow. In the end, maybe that's all that matters. The real question is it worth living without the certainties of the modern world, without the conveniences and privileges that society offers? Slab City, with all its mess, dirt, and chaos, is the answer for those seeking that extreme freedom. But what will happen when the price of freedom is greater than the ability to resist?